Welcome to Daily Dose of Aramaic Grammar Lessons. This is Lesson 3. We have been talking about particles, so this is Part 3, Relative Clause Markers. You can find more information about Aramaic relative clause markers in Biblical Aramaic for Biblical Interpreters, pages 14 to 17. Let's begin. From our study of Hebrew, we are familiar with asher, the main Biblical Hebrew relative clause marker. Instead of asher in Biblical Aramaic, we have di, this word. And interestingly, di has a broader range of uses in Aramaic than asher does in Hebrew. So let me illustrate that with some examples. We've already seen in Part 2 of Lesson 3 the use to provide further information. So this is di used twice in Daniel 4:23. That, you may know, that heaven rules. So further information supplied after each use of di. So this is very much like, as we have said, the Biblical Hebrew ki, where it's the kaf hirik yod particle. Next, another use of di. Di can also shorten construct chains. And we say it that way because, for example, we have this construct chain, the affairs of the province of Babylon in Daniel 3:12. And we have a very similar expression earlier in Daniel 2:49, the affairs of the province of Babylon, where there is a di inserted in the midst of those three words. Now we know that this is shortening what otherwise would have been a construct chain because we can see that the whole construct chain in Daniel 3:12 is definite because it ends in a proper noun, thereby giving definiteness to the whole expression, the affairs of the province of Babylon. And the same would have pertained in Daniel 2:49 except for the break inserted by having a di in there. And we notice there's the same meaning in this expression because the affairs is actually the first word. Do you see the aleph on the end? Although in this series of lessons we haven't covered this yet. Once again, this is the determined state. It's similar to the Hebrew article as far as the idea of determination. And that is the absolute form, as you would expect outside of a construct chain. So the affairs of the province of Babylon can be expressed in either of these ways, and inserting the di means that the construct starts with medinat, that word, the province word. And so in the second example, it only has two words in it instead of three, as in Daniel 3:12. Now, that having been said, we call di, this Aramaic word, the relative clause marker because its most frequent use is to serve as a marker of relative clauses. And these ideas are summarized in the English words who, whom, whose, which, that, which is providing more information about some noun idea. And there are cases in which the relative clause marker doesn't actually refer to any particular preceding noun, just like these English words can do the same thing. It's just that that's the normal use of a relative clause. So let's examine the use of di in context, which will help us see its relative clause use as well as some other uses. Ezra 5:14 has the most appearances of di in any verse in Biblical Aramaic, and you can see there are 7 of them. So let's analyze what we see in front of us in Ezra 5:14. The first clause, if you will, is, and the vessels of the house of God. So here we have, and the vessels of the house of God. And we see here that the first di has broken up what would have been a 3-member construct chain with vessels here, and then of the house of God. So we need to have vessels in the determined state if it's going to be determined, because this is outside the construct. So, and the vessels, which would be the relative clause use, but it's not which here because we're breaking up a construct. So, and the vessels of the house of God. Now, what have I done over here? Well, I've highlighted the word vessels because it'll just help in the graphical display of this verse to display every time this concept appears, because vessels is sort of the thread that runs throughout Ezra 5:14. And then in red here, I have the use of D. And I'll continue these patterns throughout. And then why have I underlined vessels of the house of God? Well, it's because the next use of D will be to introduce a relative clause. So which are the gold and the silver ones? Okay, so which vessels of the house of God are we talking about? Well, they're the ones that are the gold and silver ones. And so this second D has a very clear relative clause function. Well, why did I underline the gold and silver ones? Well, we have yet another relative clause on top of that, introduced by the third D, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple. Okay, so which ones are these gold and silver ones? Well, they're the ones which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple. And I've underlined temple because now we have another relative clause to tell us which temple. The temple, which is in Jerusalem. So look at that, 3 relative clauses stacked together, all with D's introducing them. And then the next few words, and brought them to the temple of Babylon. So in this case, we've gone back to seeing D as just something that's inserted instead of having a construct. So Temple of Babylon could have been a construct, but it's not here. We see the determined state on temple. And I've done this green arrow arrangement because these are successive actions that Nebuchadnezzar has taken. So which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple and brought them. Okay, so here we see that I have highlighted them because we're talking about those vessels again. So, and Nebuchadnezzar took these gold and silver vessels from the temple, which is in Jerusalem, and brought them. What's the them? The vessels to the temple of Babylon. Okay, so next. We're over here. Cyrus the king brought them from the temple of Babylon. So we had all this introductory information, and now we're switching over to Cyrus from having talked previously about Nebuchadnezzar. Cyrus the king brought them, so there's the them word, and it's talking about the vessels again, from the temple of Babylon. So once again, temple of Babylon expressed with a D idea instead of a construct. And they were brought to Sheshbazzar, his name. Well, and they were brought to Sheshbazzar, his name. Well, what's going to happen with the last D? Well, once again, we go back to relative clauses. Whom he made governor. Okay. So this brings us to the end of these 7 uses of D. And I hope that this has been helpful from the standpoint of seeing that there are times when D contextually needs to be a relative clause because it's providing more information, for instance, about some noun concept. Who is Sheshbazzar? Well, he's the one whom Cyrus had made governor. Which vessels are they? Well, they're the gold and silver ones, and so forth. Which temple? The one which is in Jerusalem. But they're also the uses, which we see clearly here, of breaking up what would have otherwise been construct chains. And there happens to be in this verse none of the other use, the that, providing more information use. But I think overall this has been a good review of the 3 main uses of D. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. I look forward to covering lesson 4 with you.